One way for the Virginia Company to attract investors was to leverage the reputation of its employees, or use celebrity spokespeople, so to speak. One person the Virginia Company recruited was a well known adventurer and mercenary named John Smith. John Smith was 27 years old in 1607. He had a knack for self promotion and public relations. He was born in 1580 in Willoughby, England, and started out early in life as an apprentice for a merchant. In the merchant business, he learned of the exploits of people like Francis Drake and wanted to be like them. So he quit his apprenticeship in 1596 after his father's death and signed on to a company of English mercenaries. He fought in wars for the French, King Henry IV, and for the Dutch in their War of Independence from Spain. Then he spent some time as a pirate in the Mediterranean. During that period, he became wealthy. So by 1601, he sold his services to the Austrian military to fight the Ottoman Empire. Most of what we know about Smith comes from his own accounts of his exploits, which were popular reading in England in the early 17th century. We're pretty sure he embellished a lot of his stories. Some of his stories told of winning duels against Turkish fighters with battle axes and scimitars. Eventually, he was wounded and captured in 1602 and then sold as a slave by his Turkish captors. He told a nearly unbelievable story about how he killed his owners, his captors, and traveled through Eastern Europe and Russia for more than a year before making his way back to England overland in 1604. He did manage to travel from Russia to England, so whether or not his stories were completely true, the end result was the same. He did travel pretty much on his own from Russia all the way to England in the early 17th century. So this made Smith, as well as the Sea Dogs and privateers, one of the few English people to know much of anything about the world outside England, and he was definitely a survivor. So the Virginia Company hired Smith to be their head of security for their colonization effort, promising him a good share of the potential profits. So hiring Smith made a lot of investors feel more secure that this well-known soldier and adventurer was in charge of security. So his notoriety helped attract investors. The Virginia Company planted the first permanent English colony in North America on May 6th, 1607. 105 men and boys made up the company, and they barely made it after 4 rough months at sea that killed 39 of the original 44. They chose a river with a northwest bend in the hope of finding passage to Asia, and they settled 40 miles inland to avoid detection by Spanish forces. So they named the river the James and the colony Jamestown, choosing a territory a few hundred miles north of Roanoke, thinking for whatever reason that the natives in this area would be more hospitable and the climate would be a little less harsh than the climate on the Outer Banks of North Carolina here, where Roanoke had failed. So a few hundred miles north of there, where they planted Jamestown, 40 miles inland on the James River. This shows some images of what Jamestown would have looked like. The colony had mixed success early on. Of the original 105, only 38 survived that first year of 1607. The settlers found no mineral wealth, no gold, which was very disappointing to them. The members of the initial group were not hardworking farmers. These men in adolescent men and teenagers. They were members of the middle class who had enough money to be minor investors in the Virginia Company. So they were hoping for some sort of a big windfall discovery. The larger investors, those people were not going to put their own lives at risk by traveling to Virginia. So initially, the government of the colony was supposed to be a council of the wealthiest people on the voyage. That initial council form of government turned out to be a disaster. The local Indians that the Jamestown settlers found were relatively friendly early on. The settlers situated Jamestown nearby some Algonquian speaking villages of the total population of Indians was around 10,000. And these folks made up a grouping called the Powhatan Confederacy, a loosely allied confederated group of tribes that were connected by a sachem named Powhatan. The natives were agricultural, focused on growing corn. Powhatan extracted tribute from the various villages in return for military protection from other Indians. So Powhatan saw the English as an opportunity, and he traded corn and animal hides with them in exchange for items like hatchets, swords, muskets, and other metal goods that would give him an advantage versus other native peoples. So early on, the Jamestown colony survived, but it only survived by trading with the Powhatan Indians for food. The settlers themselves, they thought that agricultural work was below them. That was for peasants. These were gentlemen of some standing. They were not peasants. They did not do this kind of menial work, and that created big problems. So these big problems occurred when the first winter hit. None of the settlers wanted to do the dirty work. They wanted the Indians to work for them. The thinking was, and they literally kind of thought this, that they were so awesome that the Indians would just voluntarily work for them. This would just occur easily. That didn't quite happen the way the colonists planned. So the governing council argued incessantly about who would work doing what, and no one wanted to do any work, so there were no results. When winter came along, the natives started bringing less food. Natives tended to get through the winter by simply eating less. Sometimes they would fast for 1 to 3 days at a time to preserve their corn during winter months. The England didn't like that, so they would try to force the natives to give them corn, and the natives refused. So as a result, life in Jamestown got very ugly, and the colony survived, but more people died. John Smith held the whole thing together from completely falling apart. So that initial winter, the whole colony almost disbanded. John Smith declared martial law, disbanded that governing council, and ordered that he that will not work shall not eat. Anyone who did not work would be whipped or imprisoned, and the remaining settlers were forced to work to survive. So the following year, after that first winter, the Virginia Company sent new settlers, this time promising land, as it became clear that gold was not available. Another difficult winter occurred the following year in 1608-1609, but still the colony remained. Hundreds of new settlers moved in and increased the population to almost 500, but then it dropped again from 500 down to 60 during a particularly harsh winter that the Virginians called the starving time, where people ate their own horses, cats, dogs, and finally rats and mice to survive. The starving time, that winter of 1609-10, was so bad that one of the Jamestown settlers killed, salted, and then consumed his pregnant wife. When the authorities found out about that, the colonists tortured and executed him. By June of 1610, the colonists were going to abandon Jamestown. John Smith left that year to go back to England. The reason he did that was because he had inflicted a wound upon himself due to his own negligence. He was standing over a fire one day, and one of his bandoliers, the little devices that hold gunpowder, yeah, that hang from your belt. One of those caught on fire because he was standing over a fire with his bandolier belt on, and it exploded, and it blew off kind of a chunk of his upper hip. So after that, he had to go back to England and never returned to Virginia except once, and then he didn't stay for very long. uh, worse than worse than that, the colony was a money sink. It was a money pit. 3 years in, it had not only produced no profit, but it was wasting the Virginia Company money. So investors were getting really upset. A man named Thomas West, the third Baron Delaware, after which the Delaware River and the colony of Delaware were eventually named. Thomas West was a big-time investor of the Virginia Company and a veteran of the Irish Wars. And he showed up with some ships and supplies and 150 men in June of 1610 after being delayed by weather in the Caribbean. And he convinced the remaining settlers to stay. Governance of the colony shifted to a strong governor system with very strict laws. The Virginia Company created new settlements upstream on the James River and kept subsidizing its existence. Still, even after 10 years, the colony was still not producing profit. It was barely breaking even. So they started being able to survive after the first 4 years or so, in large part because they changed the governance of how work relationships operated. But still, by 1611, 12, 13, colony was not making any money, and the investors were getting more and more impatient.